Hello and welcome today to our presentation on anxiety. My name's Cartwright and I work at Stony Dean as a counsellor. I also have a private practice, and over my 20 years in the profession I've seen many young people who suffer with anxiety and also adults. And I'd like just to introduce my colleague Julie McDonnell.
Hello everybody. I've been working at Stony Dean now for 11 years, and previous to that I worked in mainstream school for 5 years in an art supporting autistic young people in the classroom, and also 1 year in primary. At Stony Dean I work with the sixth form. I'm working with the life skills team and also supporting young people with their anxieties.
Thank you.
That's you.
Thank you. So anxiety, we're going to look today, is it our friend or is it our foe? And I think it's important before we start looking at this in any depth, we say that we're not here to train you, we're not here to teach you how to deal with anxiety. We realise that you're professionals who very much understand how young people are and are used to dealing with anxiety in the classroom. But this is an opportunity perhaps to have a refresher. And we wanted to facilitate a time when we could talk together about anxiety and share some of our experience working in special needs when anxiety can be very, very high among our young people. So after today, tomorrow, hopefully you'll be getting a booklet from Emma, which will give you, it's packed full of strategies and help for you in the classroom, and also lesson plans, all sorts of things for the young people to do. And this is very much across the board. It can suit a mainstream young person, it can suit young people in special ed. And Julie will be talking about this more and giving us examples soon. And then on Friday, we're opening up a Zoom meeting at 9 o'clock. And it would be lovely to meet you there and perhaps have a more in-depth chat about anxiety and how it relates to you in your class. So we can perhaps have a discussion. Is there any way we can help you with that? Okay. So today's really an overview. We're looking at adrenaline and the response of adrenaline, how that makes our young people feel. Why do we even get adrenaline? How can that be increased by diagnosis of ASD or a learning difficulty? How might we recognise a student with anxiety? And how can we help them to understand, to own and manage their own anxiety? So why anxiety? So the Child Mind Institute gave out some stats quite recently, which are quite surprising. So in the last 10 years, there's been an increased recognition of anxiety in young people by mental or healthcare professionals, including a 17% increase in anxiety disorder diagnosis. I think that's probably much higher than that. I remember when I was a rookie counsellor, when I started seeing my real first live client, every referral I received from everywhere was for anger management. But I think what's happened over the years, and this is a positive thing, is that we're recognising that there's something under anger, that anger is fueled by something else, and that's anxiety. So now I get many referrals for anxiety. And what's so sad is this statistic that although it affects 30% of children and adolescents, 80% never get help. And certainly I know when I work with my adults that if they'd had more help understanding it as young people, they could be on a different trajectory, a different career, and not embedded in these behaviours that were caused by anxiety. So is it our friend or is it our foe? I talk with my clients a lot about anxiety being our friend or foe. So do you remember the first time you had a date with somebody, your very first date, how excited you were, how you fizzled with adrenaline? The night before you couldn't sleep, that morning you spent ages in the bathroom, you made sure you looked your very best, your most beautiful, your most handsome for that date. That was anxiety. Anxiety was your friend. It helped you, it gave you the motivation, and it also protected you. Perhaps if that date didn't go as well as you thought, you're aware that this person might not be as safe as you thought they were. Anxiety was your friend. The trouble with anxiety is we can fall out with it. If we don't listen to it, if we don't pick up the signals that it's trying to tell us something, anxiety can make us go into a hyper alert state where it's constantly turning around in us and causing anxiety and upset. It gets to the stage where our bodies overreact in moments of no real threat, when it's merely in our mind, and it stops us being our best. Anxiety at this stage is definitely your foe. Okay, I'm very sorry that I'm actually doing this not on slideshow, but what we found is that if we did this presentation on slideshow, our faces were taking over the slide. So I'm sorry that we're having to do it this way, but I hope it makes sense and you can see it. Okay. So anxiety, what is it? Well, let's go back to our early cave-dwelling ancestors. They needed anxiety to survive. At all times they were in danger, especially when the hunters were out gathering the food for the evening. There could be an apex predator around every tree, and certainly they had to have their wits about them. They would have been listening, they would have been hearing, they would have been trying to smell any threat. And when they did, their breath would instinctively fasten up, which would release adrenaline into their bloodstream. The flood of adrenaline would give them the ability to hopefully fight the predator, fly from the predator, or freeze and remain so still that hopefully the predator walked away without realizing they were there. After this, hopefully they were then able to catch their prey and go back to their site. And that night, round the fire, they'd have a chance to talk about what happened during the day, how they got that prey, what danger they were in, with their understanding and supportive tribe. So they had the adrenaline come up in their body, but they were able to release it. They were able to do what they needed to do with it. They survived, and later on they were able to process it. The trouble is that even though we're much more civilized now, our brains are still in that stage. We haven't evolved as fast as our civilization has. And now, of course, our threats aren't apex predators. They're not lions, tigers, and bears. We go shopping. Our stresses now will be a maths exam, a public speaking event, or there'll be something like a bad relationship or something that upsets us. So unfortunately, because our brains are wired in this way, they respond the same way. We have an enormous impact of adrenaline drenching our systems. We try and react to it, but we can't. We're having to sit still, we're having to sit in that exam, or we're having to listen to the partner who's shouting at us. And then later, we don't get the time to process it, because actually by the evening, most people have moved on to something else. And I'm sure you know as well as we do that in many schools, sitting around the table at the end of the day and asking how your day is doesn't happen so much. So our young people are still caught up with this horrible feeling of adrenaline pulsating through their bodies, but having no release, no way to process it. So this slide, I think, might be hard for you to see right now. So I hope that you'll take the opportunity to look at the book, because it's certainly in the book. And all I wanted to highlight was the physical effects of adrenaline. So adrenaline is released from our brain and it floods our whole system. You might feel adrenaline in your stomach or your head, your arms might tingle, your feet might feel weird, but actually adrenaline is coursing through your whole body. When it's released like this, it goes around the whole system. And the trouble with it is that if it's not released, it affects our intellectual system, it affects our academic capacity. We can't think logically when this is going on. And it's also not good for us. If it keeps being released, it will cause long-term health problems. So we really do need to help our young people understand this and know how to deal with it in a healthy way. So the problem with anxiety is always how it feels. All these are quotes from young people over the years and adults who I know suffer with anxiety. So they might be crying, they can't regulate their emotional responses, they're edgy and nervous. Some of them will say, I've got a constant fear of dread. That comes up a lot in the counselling room. Something terrible is about to happen and I don't know what it is. But also what happens is they get exhausted. Remember, adrenaline keep being released makes you tired. So they end up getting demotivated. They end up feeling empty and numb, tired, not able to concentrate. So that they have almost like the two different ways of coping with it. And the thing about our young people is often they don't even realise this is anxiety. And probably they've been told by other people or they've read stuff, oh, it's a teen response, it's hormones. Yes, it is. But it can be really disabling and it can be really frightening. And not to know why you're feeling that way is exhausting and terrifying for our young people. So, where does it come from? Now, I know we all have different experiences of anxiety, and many people say to me, why does it affect some people more than others? So let's look at a classic scenario that I'm sure you've gone through a million times. You arrive at school in the morning, your lesson's planned, you know what you're doing, you know where you're going, you're looking forward to welcoming the young people. In they come. Well, I say in they come. In crashes Johnny. He's already in a filthy mood. Somebody's upset him on the playground or something. He shouts, he won't speak to you. He slumps down, throws his bag across the floor. And when you ask him if he's okay, he tells you in no uncertain terms to go away, but using more colourful language. Then you've got Susan. Susan can't even get into the classroom. Susan's stuck in the doorway with an LSA. She's having another panic attack. You don't even know whether she's going to come into your lesson. And then you've got Paul, peaceful Paul, right in the middle of it, sitting, smiling at you. You know he has a bad time at home. You know things are tough for him, but he's happy, he's willing to listen, and he's waiting for the lesson to start. So why does Johnny react the way Johnny reacts? Why does Susan react the way she reacts and Paul the way he reacts to the same lesson, the same environment, and you using all the tools to have a good lesson? Well, when we look at this chart, I hope you can see just how complicated anxiety is. The roots of anxiety are deep. It's a complex network which might include any of these, more often than not, more than 5 or 6. Especially for our young people with ASD and sensory processing disorder, it can be extra tough. So if our young people can't recognise what anxiety is, they just know they feel rubbish, how can we recognise anxiety in them? And I think these are quite a few ways that our young people tell us they're anxious. I certainly know in the counselling room, I can be sitting with a young person who would tell me, I feel fine. But actually, they're biting their nails, they kind of need to go to the toilet more than once, the difficulty focusing on the session. All these things are their way of really telling me that deep down they're very anxious. And it's exactly the same in the classroom. And now I'm going to hand over to Julie, and Julie's going to talk a little bit more about how anxiety can be really heightened for young people who have special needs. You there, Julie? You've got the mic on. You've got to unmute. Sorry, everybody. Hello.
I was very involved in that. I was getting into that was really lovely, really excellent. Hello, everybody. Lovely to be here. Just wanted to talk a little about sensory processing disorder and how it's linked to ADHD and autism. Sensory issues can be totally overwhelming and can make it extremely hard to function, especially in an overstimulating, busy school environment. And we all know what it's like. I'm going to a corridor and a change of classes, particularly if you've got sensory issues, and the sounds, the smells, the sights, touch, someone bumps into you, balance, movement, weaving in between each other, heaving that heavy bag on your shoulder, seeing someone that you don't like, and all those overreacting feelings are happening as you're walking through, and then you've got to sit down and concentrate again in the next class. we were talking, Chris and I were talking and saying that how do we explain, or how do we sort of imagine for ourselves having that constant adrenaline rush? And one of the things we were talking about was that sensation, particularly when you're a teenager and you're swinging on your chair. And I used to do this at home, and I used to get in trouble for it. And I used to be swinging on my chair, and my dad used to just walk behind me, grab my chair and just touch it. And I go, like this. And with that feeling, I just remember that feeling coming up through my stomach into my throat, and my whole body would be, well, the adrenaline rush was there in seconds, and I'd be very angry with him and tell him off, but I did stop it in the end, which is a good thing. But that feeling of that shock, your whole body is tingling, that feeling is probably how I would imagine you might feel if you have sensory processing disorder. So everything that happens to you that makes you shocked, you say you've got heightened hearing and someone bashes a chair on the floor, that adrenaline rush might go through you immediately, and then the bright light and you wonder what it is. So that over and over again through the day must be totally exhausting to cope with if you don't know how to cope with it or strategies to help regulate yourself. So just something to think of, how they may feel day in, day out. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you. Okay. So this can all feel a bit of doom and gloom so far, can't it?
Yeah.
For young people, it's on the increase. Anxiety is becoming more. They don't know how to deal with it. They don't even know what it's called. Often parents also can suffer from anxiety, long-term difficulties. How are we going to help our young people? And I think the really important thing to remember is our greatest tool is actually us. It starts with us. We're there with our young people, and for us to model dealing with anxiety, it's really important for them. Now, I'm sure there's been times when you've come into the classroom and you're feeling quite anxious. Perhaps something's happened at home, had a row with your partner, you're worried about one of your own children being ill. And when you've got there, you think, oh, goodness me, what's wrong with these young people? They're all kicking off. The likelihood is that you've projected your anxiety onto them, and our young people are like sponges. They pick it up unconsciously and they jolly well give it back. The other side is that you can go in and you feel calm as anything. By the end of the day, you're feeling absolutely raw with anxiety. Anxiety has been given to you by the young people. Because the way us counsellors look at it is anxiety is like a planet. It spins on its axis and the gravity pulls in other people. So all the time that we're not able to deal with our anxiety, we can project it to other people, but they can also project it back to us. And that's quite an important thing to remember when you're working with young people who perhaps haven't even got the maturity to own their anxiety yet. And for that reason, I think it's good for us to spend a little bit of time thinking about how we can help ourselves. And Julie's going to talk us through how you can help yourself with anxiety.
Thank you, Chris. We're talking about classroom anxieties and the pupils, but sometimes when you're helping a student or a young person access and understand their own anxieties, I quite often tend to look at myself and think about how understand how I become anxious or when I am becoming anxious. So it's good to sometimes think about how you might feel. So break it down so we recognise our own body signals. And how do we know when we're feeling anxious? And it's quite complex, really, especially if you have sensory processing disorders where you aren't reading your body signals or you don't really understand them. So sometimes I might give them an experience that I've had and how I feel and what I might do in that situation. And of course, there's always your breathing techniques, which you can practice with them. exercise, and you start to give them ideas. So look towards yourself. How did you feel? What did your body change like? How did it tell you were becoming anxious? And how did your thoughts change? Did you start thinking differently? Did you behave differently? Did your mannerisms change? And once you start to analyze yourself and know yourself, which I'm sure you all do because you manage your anxieties, then that seems to help when you're supporting our young people. I hope that makes sense. Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, no, thank you, Julie. Okay. So what we would always say about anxiety is it is absolutely exhausting. There's no doubt about that. There's a reason why counsellors aren't advised to see over a certain number of clients a week. It can be exhausting being in a room with an anxious young person. But also as a teacher, it can be absolutely exhausting. And as an LSA, working with those young people. So please look after yourself. If you don't take anything away from this, apart from this, please remember that those cave dwellers got around the fire every night, had a chat with each other, listened to each other, and help them process everything. It's not a problem to have a cup of coffee in the staff room, to make sure that you do actually get your lunchtime break when you can. Please look after yourself. Now we're going to look at another way of working with anxiety, another strategy that we find really beneficial. And I personally do this myself. I know a lot of other people do. So if you remember about those cave dwellers and the anxiety and what triggered it to flood their systems, it's always breathing. So your breathing gets faster and that triggers a response. But of course, we don't need that adrenaline to face that maths exam or to speak to a family member who we don't get on with. We need to be calm. We need to be logical. So for our young people, actually helping them to learn to trick their brain to say they're calm is really important. If you can slow your breathing down, the brain will not release all that adrenaline, and that makes such a difference. So this is what we call our square breathing, and this is another strategy in the booklet we'll be sending to you. So we're working on perhaps a young person of about 12 or 13 who would have a smaller lung capacity, but you might want to put this out with a sixth former who's probably got better lung capacity than some of us. So please increase the number depending upon their comfort. For an adult, normally you'll breathe in for 7 and breathe out for 11. For a young person, perhaps 4 and 6. Work out where they feel comfortable with their breathing capacity. But the trick is to really slow your breathing down and to breathe out longer than you breathe in. And we find this is almost miraculous in classrooms. Young people really feel calm after doing this. And the really important thing to do is to practice it. Don't wait until you're anxious to do it, but practice. If I can't get to sleep, I try it. More often than not, in about 10 minutes, I'm really gone. I'm fast asleep. It really does help. Okay, now Julie's going to talk a little bit more about your booklet. Thank you, Julie.
We'd like to send you some resources that hopefully might help you or you may be able to find useful. The booklet that we've designed is called Coping with Anxiety, but you could change it to Wellbeing Booklet. And it's been used to support in PSHE lessons. We can use it in tutor time, and one-to-one support's very useful too. I think it's best to be used as a small group, so you've got adult input to lead them and guide them and help lead the discussion. Individual pages can be printed and used for one-to-one for certain interventions. You can also use them and adapt them and alter them to suit the classes as in age group. So hopefully I can give you a working PowerPoint if we can get it through the internet in one piece, so that it can be altered. One of the, I think, really important things is that this booklet can be sent home as maybe a homework, so that it's discussed once it's complete with family members, so that they can discuss their own stresses and their own anxieties, and maybe learn a little bit about their own child, because quite often once the discussions open up, they do learn about one another. Also, we've been developing it so that it can be used independently using IT, where there's some YouTube clips that are really useful and they can work on their own. So if you're doing an intervention, or they're coming into a hub or something, they could work on that independently. And also, it's really good to use as an evidence and record progression. So it could be used over a key stage, and at the end you can look at it and say, you can see how they've moved on, and they can see how they've moved on. Thank you. Hobbies and interests, so important as a way of encouraging conversation skills and building friendships, of course, but also it helps for them to see their own strengths, abilities, qualities and achievements. And personal preferences are really important because they're part of your own makeup and your personality. Why we start with this is to, once we get to know them a little bit more and they discuss it with their other peers, we can use these later on to encourage relaxation strategies. So calming music, or going for a bike ride, or going for a walk, walking the dog. Once we have this information, it's much easier to put in the strategies later. So this is a very important first step. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
Visuals are really important, particularly with our ASD pupils, as imagination can be challenging for them, or starting to understand. We find just giving them some prompts opens up the conversation, and once that's flowing, they can start realising and hopefully discussing with other members of staff and pupils, and realising that we all have triggers, we all have anxieties, and this really helps having the visuals, and hopefully even your older pupils might still be able to access this. Thank you, Chris. This is just some ideas of strategies that you could, in theory, want to cut up, pop them inside their planner. They might try that for a week. They might try being allowed to take a walk, talk to a friend, do some exercise in the playground maybe, come back in and then sort of say, did that work for you? Did that work? So it's about finding the strategy that works for them, and then maybe they can start implementing them during school time if possible, or at home, to help them start coping with their own anxieties and adrenaline rushes.
Okay, so I hope today we've maybe touched on anxiety a little bit. Hopefully we've given you a flavour for this booklet and all the strategies and suggestions that you can use in there. I'd like to say that I know this booklet's used throughout our school in every year group for lots of different reasons, and the young people really like it. So it's important to look after ourselves. To remember that most behaviour comes from anxiety deep down. So how the pupil reacts, even if acting out, is often because of the adrenaline in their bodies. This is a normal response. But when somebody's feeling really anxious, the adrenaline means they're unable to access the thinking part of their brain, so solving academic difficulties. And this is useless, and it just increases anxiety. Remember what helps you when you are anxious, and perhaps identify ways with the pupil of helping them to recognise where their anxiety sits, what the physical changes are. Talk about what will help them to calm down and to implement these. It's been really good meeting you today. Hopefully we'll meet you properly on Friday when we can talk some more. And in the meantime, you'll be getting a book from Emma. Okay, so it's goodbye from me.
It's goodbye from me.
Okay. Bye.
See you Friday.
See you Friday. Yeah.